Welcome back to Pokemon episode summaries. Today, I'll be doing episode 251. I Polly told you so. The episode begins with Ash and the gang continuing on their way to Blackthorn City as usual when they get a little tired, so they decide to stop and take a break for lunch by a lake. They invite out all their Pokemon to have a little picnic with them, as Ash sends out his Noctowl, Bayleaf, Cyndaquil, Totodile, and Phanpy. Misty sends out her Politoed, Corsola, Togepi, obviously, and Psyduck, and Brock sends out his Geodude, Onix, Pineco, and Crobat. Although Pineco didn't stay out for some reason, nor did Ash's Noctowl, and Misty just didn't let out her Staryu or Goldeen. Anyways, Brock makes some rice balls for lunch, and Ash, Misty, and all the Pokemon gratefully enjoy them, as they compliment Brock on how fucking good the food was, and thank him. All of the Pokemon even cry out in happiness. Brock is honored by this, so he immediately cooks more rice balls, and divides them all evenly to the Pokemon, so they wouldn't fight over them. Having put his absolute heart and soul into making these rice balls, and he didn't want them to go to waste. As the Pokemon and Ash continued to eat, Misty found out that she was unfortunately full, so instead of eating, she just tried to enjoy the beautiful scenery by the lake, but got distracted by both Ash eating like a fucking monster, and Politoed clapping its hands happily as it ate. As Misty zones out, thinking about Poliwhirl's evolution into Politoed, she almost missed when Cyndaquil happily scoffed down 2 rice balls at the same time, and as a result, choked, since it tried to swallow them whole, and that obviously didn't work out very well. However, all the Pokemon saw Cyndaquil then fall over as it choked, and their cries alerted Ash over to Cyndaquil as he ran up to it and asked if it was okay. He realized that this was a dumbass question, though, as he realized that Cyndaquil was choking to death, so he patted it on the back, hoping to dislodge the rice balls. The pat on the back did seem to work, as it caused Cyndaquil to use Flamethrower to burp up the rice balls, although the Flamethrower burned Ash's face in the process. Cyndaquil immediately tries to apologize to its trainer, but Ash tells it not to bother, assuring Cyndaquil that he was fine, and that Cyndaquil's food must have just been a little spicy. An obvious joke. After this little scuffle and the big meal, everyone was tired out, so they decided to take a midday nap, as Ash slept with all of his Pokemon, Brock slept with all his, and Misty slept with all of hers. However, Politoed eventually woke up before anyone else. As soon as it woke up, the first thing it spotted was 2 rice balls, which for some reason hadn't been eaten yet, and he instantly decided to go to them, being hungry as fuck and having an immense craving. It eagerly grabs one of them and instantly scoffs it down, but since it had grabbed the rice ball so hard, the other rice ball went flying off of the plate that it was sitting on and rolled down the hill, leaving Politoed to chase after it into a grassy meadow filled with bushes, where it desperately tries to look for the missing rice ball, only to encounter a woman named Tammy, who appeared to be trying to practice cheerleading, but she wasn't doing it super successfully, as she appeared to be distracted, looking for something. So, Politoed went up to her, wanting to help her. It's revealed, though, that what Tammy was looking for was her Politoed, and she believed that this Politoed was hers, as she yelled at it for trying to play hide-and-seek with her and running away, and also gets angry at it, claiming that it had lost its red headband, and it wasn't supposed to. It once again confirming that this Politoed wasn't hers, because this Politoed didn't wear a goddamn red headband. Politoed was obviously confused by Tammy's anger, and just did what it usually did, which was clap joyfully. Upon seeing this, Tammy remembered why she loved Politoed so much, and couldn't help but stop being mad at it, as she continued to do her cheerleading practice, as she put a headband on herself, now able to do the cheerleading since she was relaxed, thinking that her Politoed had returned. Politoed seemed to be intrigued by the cheerleading, as it began to copy her moves. Tammy was surprised that Politoed was able to do such good cheerleading even without its headband, thinking that that was a requirement, but still decides to try and put another headband on Politoed, although Politoed declines, as it didn't see the point in this, so it walked away. Tammy didn't want to lose what she believed to be her Politoed again, so she decided not to put a headband on it and grabbed it by its arm as she took it somewhere, as her actual Politoed, still with a red headband, watched in the distance, having just come out from the bushes and confused as to why Tammy was going away with a different Politoed. Tammy and Politoed eventually arrive just outside what appeared to be a cheerleading building, as there was a cheerleading class going on inside, where a third Politoed was being trained by the teacher to do some cheerleading moves. However, much like how Tammy was having trouble doing her cheerleading moves because she was concerned that her Politoed was gone before, the teacher was having trouble teaching, as it was concerned since its Sunfloras had disappeared from the area. As Tammy heard the teacher call out for her Sunflora right as she approached the outside of the building, Tammy then spotted the Sunflora hiding behind the building for no fucking reason, and she immediately went inside the building and delivered the Sunflora to her, leading the teacher to thank her for finding them. The teacher then spots Politoed and claims that she didn't recognize it, but Tammy was adamant that this was her Politoed, explaining that the teacher probably just didn't recognize it because it didn't have its headband on, and proceeded to tell Politoed to do its cheerleading moves to prove that Politoed was in fact her Politoed. As Politoed did the cheerleading moves, the teacher applauded, coming to the conclusion that yes, this was Tammy's Politoed, even though it wasn't. Tammy then goes to show all of the other grass-type Pokemon in the cheerleading classes the Politoed, exclaiming that she had finally found it after it had went missing, as all the grass Pokemon, being Jumpluff, Blossom, and Sunflora, crowd around the Politoed, and all act very confused upon seeing it. This makes Tammy realize that the teacher's initial assumption about the Politoed not being her own was in fact true, because she knew that the other grass Pokemon could sense if Politoed was actually Politoed. However, Misty's Politoed saw that the rest of the grass Pokemon were uncomfortable, so it decided to try and impress them with its cheerleading moves, such as its signature claps. The Blossom begin to get comfortable as they begin dancing to Politoed's clapping, and singing as well, which pleases Tammy and the teacher. As Polytoad continues to clap, the Jumpluff and Sunflora also begin getting comfortable as well, as they dance and sing to the clapping as well. Seeing that all the grass Pokemon were comfortable around Polytoad, Tammy was at first shocked, as she thought her Polytoad was the best at doing this, but upon seeing this Polytoad's quick assimilation into the group, she decided to let Polytoad stay and continue clapping, exclaiming that she loved any Polytoad. Meanwhile, back with Ash and the gang, they had since all woken up from their midday nap, along with their Pokemon, and Ash and the gang decided that it was time to continue on their journey, so they all recalled their Pokemon, with Brock's Onix being the last one to be recalled, when Misty suddenly realized that she couldn't find Polytoad anywhere. Ash and the gang initially panic, so they go and search for Polytoad somewhere, and eventually they think that they see Polytoad further upon the hill, so they run toward the hill to go ask where the fuck it went. When suddenly, Ash remarked that the ground felt like it was giving away, and as if on cue, the ground did give away, as Ash and the gang fell into a pitfall trap, which of course was done by none other than Team Rocket, who jumped out of the bushes, revealing themselves as they do their motto. Right as the motto ended, Meowth placed a large metal plate over the pitfall trap, which trapped Ash and the gang inside. Damn, actually smart, now they couldn't actually get out of the hole. Despite not being able to escape, Ash and the gang could still yell immensely loud through the covered hole, and that's what they did, demanding their freedom. Team Rocket didn't pay any attention to Ash and the gang though, as they were too occupied as they had saw Tracy's Polytoad, as it was trying to run away, frightened by what Team Rocket was doing. How did it end up in the area, you may ask? I don't know, it was probably just fucking walking around randomly. When Team Rocket see this Polytoad, they instantly assume that it was Misty's, trying to come to the rescue, so they have Meowth go and attack it, convincing Meowth to battle because he was a Pokemon and didn't do enough battling, and Meowth agreed with this. Misty hears Team Rocket mention that they had encountered her Polytoad, and since she couldn't actually see that it wasn't her Polytoad due to being trapped in the hole, she assumed that Team Rocket knew what they were talking about, and yelled from inside the hole for what she thought was her Polytoad to run the fuck away. Anyways, Meowth didn't let Polytoad get away, as it went in for a Fury Swipes, but its Fury Swipes was stopped, as the Polytoad, which was apparently nicknamed Bean, stuck out its long tongue and licked Meowth, which stopped him from advancing towards Polytoad and caused him to get knocked back. Practically knocked out by this point. Jesse and James were impressed by Polytoad's power and declared that they wanted it for themselves, so they go up to it with a contract, just like they did with Chikorita in that one episode, and try to convince it to somehow sign it to join Team Rocket. They didn't even want to capture it, they just wanted it to be a part of Team Rocket's ranks, because they were so impressed by it. Polytoad obviously couldn't understand what the contract read though, so it just stood there confused, leaving Team Rocket to try and explain that if it signed the contract, it would get vacations and pensions. Yeah, I don't know about that. Did you guys even get vacations and pensions? When this doesn't work, Jesse simply tries to explain the contract word for word, but Polytoad still stood there confused, and to make matters worse for Team Rocket, Ash and the gang then managed to escape from the hole, lifting up the seal over it. I'm not gonna lie, I don't know how they did this, Brock just must be really strong, but once Ash and the gang were out of the hole, Misty, still thinking that the Polytoad was hers, warned Polytoad not to join Team Rocket, reminding it that it had fought against them before many times, and they were bad people. Team Rocket get angry at Misty for trying to take her Polytoad away from them, so James tries to convince the Polytoad that they were actually good people, and reminded it of the benefits it would get if it signed the contract, but before James could finish his explanation, Wobbuffet then forcibly popped out of his Pokeball, forcing Jesse to recall it. Meowth tried to get into the conversation as well, and remind Polytoad of all the benefits, but Polytoad wasn't falling for any of it now, as it believed Misty, and proceeded to refuse Team Rocket's request by telling Meowth, which Meowth translated to Jesse and James, as Polytoad in fact saying that it wasn't interested in joining Team Rocket. Team Rocket then tried to capture it anyways, leading Ash to interfere, and have his Pikachu use Thunderbolt to send them blasting off. With Team Rocket gone, Misty runs up to what she still believed to be her Polytoad, and goes to hug it, happy that it was safe, but she then notices the red headband on it, which makes her realize that this Polytoad wasn't hers. As for what Misty's Polytoad was actually doing, Tammy was essentially doing a huge cheerleading operation with Polytoad and all the grass Pokemon, as she was instructing her grass Pokemon to dance, as Polytoad made a little song with its claps that the Pokemon could dance to. Polytoad then claps immensely, as the grass Pokemon do their signature finishing dancing move, where they form a pyramid with Polytoad at the head of it now. Back with Ash and the gang, they were now searching for Misty's Polytoad, once again, with Tammy's Polytoad Bean still following them, as Misty stated her assumption that her Polytoad and Bean had been mixed up somehow. Ash and the gang then passed by the cheerleading building, and Bean looked into the building courtyard along with Misty, as they both spotted Misty's Polytoad with Tammy, with Misty correctly inferring that a cheerleading act was going on. Although Misty wanted to get her Polytoad back, she was enamored by the awesome cheerleading, so she stayed put for a little bit. Although, Bean was immensely angry, noticing that it had seemingly been replaced, as, you know, it used to be the one to do all the clapping for the grass Pokemon, so it runs up to Tammy, trying to jump back into her arms, wanting to become the main Polytoad again, and he thought that Tammy would actually accept him, as Tammy enthusiastically greeted him at first, being glad to see him back. Unfortunately for Bean, though, Tammy soon changes her mood, explaining that although she was happy to see Polytoad back, she had realized that Misty's Polytoad was just a lot better at cheerleading, and therefore, her Polytoad had been replaced, and she was now going to use Misty's Polytoad. Which now just made Bean go from mad to happy, now to absolutely fucking depressed, as it now didn't have the respect of its owner that much, and had been replaced. Ash and the gang overhear this, and so they run over to Tammy, with Misty declaring that Tammy couldn't use her Polytoad, explaining that it was hers. Tammy was initially skeptical of this, but Polytoad proved that Misty was telling the truth, as it ran over to it, happily dancing around and clapping. Tammy apologizes for doubting Misty, as Ash and the gang and Tammy introduce themselves to each other, with Ash introducing himself as a future Pokemon master. Tammy then introduces herself and explains that she was a cheerleader planning to enter a huge national cheerleading conference, which was a very famous event, adding that she was trying to enter her grass Pokemon and as the dancers and her Politoed as a cheerleader, since she knew that Politoed would be a great cheerleader. Ash didn't understand what Tammy meant by this, but Misty did full well, having watched Politoed clap multiple times, and knowing that clapping was a huge move for many cheerleaders because she had been fascinated by cheerleaders her entire childhood, wanting to become one herself. Seeing how happy Politoed was with clapping, Misty realized that Politoed must have wandered off and saw Tammy practicing cheerleading and wanted to join in, so that's why Tammy must have taken it. Tammy confirms this, though admits that she had gotten her Politoed, Bean, and Misty's Politoed mixed up by accident. Misty then goes to take her Politoed back, but Tammy reminds her that she wanted her Politoed as opposed to her own to perform in the cheerleading competition, asking Misty if it would be okay if she borrowed her Politoed to practice with it for a while and enter the competition. To convince Misty to let Tammy borrow her Politoed, she proceeded to show off her Politoed's immense cheerleading skills as it proceeded to lead all of Tammy's other grass Pokemon while doing its signature clapping. Tammy then also tried to convince Misty by exclaiming that she knew she could win first place in the contest with Misty's Politoed because of how good a cheerleader it was. Misty admits that her Politoed was definitely a good cheerleader and actually debates giving her Politoed to her. However, she questions why Tammy couldn't just use her own Politoed Bean, and looks over towards it, noticing that it was now standing all alone, and looked extremely sad, seeing Misty's Politoed getting all the attention. Tammy didn't care about this though, as she retorted that she couldn't use Bean, since it was clear that Bean didn't enjoy cheerleading, as it had run away from her before. Misty rebutted that Bean probably did like cheerleading, as it looked extremely sad upon not being able to join the grass Pokemon. However, Tammy retorted back that Bean was merely just sad because Tammy had yelled at it earlier and rejected it, and it probably just couldn't stand rejection. Misty once again rebutted that this wasn't the fucking case, and stated that she would only let Tammy use her Politoed if she agreed to let Bean join in as well. Tammy agreed to this, just desperate to get Misty's Politoed, which meant that Misty allowed her Politoed to keep training with Tammy, as Tammy then ordered Misty's Politoed, her Politoed, and all of her grass Pokemon to resume their cheerleading practice. The grass Pokemon and Misty's Politoed excitedly started practicing again, but as for Bean, it was disappointed, being a second option and nothing more, knowing that Tammy didn't care about it, and walked away sadly. Nami tried to call for it, in fear that if it walked away, then Misty would take back her Politoed, but Bean continued to walk away. Tammy pleaded Misty not to take back her Politoed, explaining that she hoped that Bean would come back eventually, it just needed some time to get over its depression and not being able to handle being a second choice. Thankfully for Tammy, the last thing on Misty's mind was getting back her own Politoed. She instead wanted to do something to go cheer up Tammy's Politoed, who has now walked out of the area. So, Ash and the gang go after it, as Brock and Ash felt bad for Bean as well. With Ash and the gang gone, Tammy took the opportunity to go back to training with Misty's Politoed and all of her grass Pokemon, as Team Rocket spied from a nearby cliff with binoculars on this practice, leading Meowth to go into a fantasy about giving Giovanni all of the dancing grass Pokemon, and stating that Giovanni would be very pleased if they gave him that many Pokemon. James added that if they captured Misty's Politoed as well, being the leader of the dancing squad, with all of his cheerleading, Giovanni may like them so much that he could remove their debt with Delibird and give them a raise. So with that, Team Rocket decided to try and capture Misty's Politoed as well as all of the grass Pokemon. Through some binoculars, they then also noticed Ash and the gang chasing after Bean, so they declared that they would also get Pikachu and Bean as well, trying to keep an eye on both Tammy and her group and Ash and the gang and Bean at the same time. Speaking of Ash and the gang, they were still chasing after Bean, determined to cheer it up, and they eventually managed to cut it off by the edge of a river. Misty tried to console Bean, stating that she was sure that Tammy still liked it, but was probably just mad at Bean for running away and misunderstood his reasoning. So, Misty suggested that Bean should apologize to Tammy for running away to make her see that it still wanted to do cheerleading. Bean seemingly didn't want to do this, as it proceeded to run away, leading Misty to realize that maybe Tammy's assumption was right after all, that Bean just couldn't handle rejection of any way, shape, or form. So now, it wanted to be pissy towards Tammy because it was mad at it. So, Misty suggested that Ash and the gang just leave it alone now, so that Bean could work out its own issues. Brock agrees that Misty's attempt to reason with Bean did not go well, and states that he would happily go back with Misty and Ash to Tammy, as he hadn't got a chance to flirt with Tammy yet. This leads Misty to get annoyed with Brock, and drag him off by the ear, though she stops when Ash and Pikachu bring her attention to Bean, who was walking past the river into a prairie and was practicing its cheerleading. This made Ash and the gang realize that Bean did in fact like cheerleading to some extent, but its sadness towards Tammy must have now changed to anger due to seeing how Tammy didn't want it anymore. And because of this anger, it didn't want to apologize to Tammy or try and make amends with it anymore whatsoever, despite really wanting to do cheerleading. So it must have wanted to try and do cheerleading on its own. Misty and Brock decided to still go back to Tammy to inform her that she was going to have to apologize to Bean, as Bean wouldn't apologize to her, even though it really wanted to do cheerleading, and Ash decides to stay behind and try and cheer Bean up. Essentially, Ash believed that Tammy likely wouldn't apologize to Bean, so he thought that Bean apologizing to Tammy would still be the only way. So he knew that he would have to try and get Bean in a better state of mind first if Bean was going to be willing to apologize. So he had to get rid of its anger. So Pikachu first tried to just simply talk to it to calm its anger down, but Bean didn't listen. So Pikachu then tried to make several funny faces at it, stretching its face out, also doing some funny poses. Ash was hiding behind a tree during this so that Pikachu could try and convince Bean all on its own, as Ash thought that maybe Bean was somewhat against all humans now, so he thought a Pokemon on Pokemon talk would be better. But unfortunately, although Pikachu's posing was beginning to make Politoed crack a smile and laugh a little bit, and by Politoed I mean Bean, Pikachu's poses also made Ash laugh extremely loud, therefore revealing Ash's hiding place, leading Ash to apologize for ruining Pikachu's moment with Bean, but stated that he couldn't help himself from laughing because Pikachu was so funny. Thankfully, Bean was still there, so Ash tried to talk to it, telling it to get rid of its anger, but this comment just seemed to make Bean even angrier, as it then slapped Ash and Pikachu out of the way and ran off further into the prairie. Ash and Pikachu tried to call out for it to come back, but it was already too far gone. Meanwhile, Brock and Misty had returned to where Tammy was and saw that Tammy had already started using Misty's Politoed in the practice while they were gone. Misty reminded Tammy that she said she had only agreed to give her Politoed if Bean joined as well, and explained how it seemed as though Bean did in fact like cheerleading, and tried to convince Tammy to take Bean back as her only Politoed, not only because of that, but because she and her grass Pokemon had spent more time with Bean anyways, essentially saying that Tammy shouldn't give up her friendship with her Politoed after they had been friends for so long. But Tammy remains adamant that she wanted Misty's Politoed, begging her to officially give it to her for not just the training, but for the contest, explaining that even though she had spent more time with her own Politoed, she felt closer to this one, and knew that it would be a better fit for all her other grass Pokemon, and was particularly fond of it because she knew for a fact that Misty's Politoed could win them the contest as opposed to her own Politoed. Seeing that Misty was still obviously hesitant to fully lend over her Politoed to Tammy, Tammy tried to entice Misty more by assuring her that she would give Misty her Politoed back after the contest. Although Brock retorted that that would mean that Ash and the gang would have to go out of their way to go back to this area to get Misty's Politoed when the contest was over, as opposed to just continuing their journey, and they didn't want to have to go out of their way. Misty agreed with Brock's claim, and asked if the competition really was that important, stating that Tammy should just give up on the contest, even if it was important, since she wasn't using her own Politoed. This led Tammy to reveal that the contest was super important to her, and she was wanting to use Misty's Politoed because she was desperate to win, because she wanted her and her Pokemon to become very famous cheerleaders so that people could watch and they could bring more happiness to the people. Essentially, she wanted to become famous, but she also wanted to bring happiness to the world through cheerleading, and clarified that the contest could help her and her Pokemon achieve this because it was so big. Brock and Misty were shocked at Tammy's seemingly noble intentions, and Tammy used their shock to her advantage as she proceeded to order all her grass Pokemon and Misty's Politoed to continue training. The training starts with the grass Pokemon getting into their signature pyramid dancing pose, with Politoed at the top of the pyramid leading them, until the last part of the practice, where a Jumpluff accidentally trips and falls, messing up the entire pyramid, and causing everyone else to fall down as well. Tammy begins to scold not just the Jumpluff that tripped, but every single grass Pokemon, stating that she was ashamed with every single one of them for their failure, which horrified Brock and Misty, because they didn't realize that Tammy could be so rude to all of her Pokemon, to the point where all of her grass Pokemon were beginning to cry. This just makes Misty and Brock even more horrified, because Tammy proceeds to scold her grass Pokemon for crying as well. Misty got so pissed off at Tammy that she decided to step in. But before she could say anything, Tammy instantly began apologizing to her on the grass Pokemon's behalf for being failures and embarrassing themselves in front of her. But Misty rebuttals that their failure didn't matter at all. What mattered was if her Pokemon were safe after the fall, stating that that should have been her number one priority, to check on them. Also adding that she wouldn't get anywhere as a cheerleader by making her Pokemon sad, and that she should accept failure when it happened. Misty then goes to show Tammy an example of how she should act around her Pokemon, as she went up to her Politoed and checked on it to make sure it was okay. Politoed was okay, and was actually currently clapping in an effort to help all of the grass Pokemon get happy again and start dancing, to forget about the yelling that had just occurred. And thankfully, it was working, as all the Sunfloras, Jumpluffs, and Blossoms were now happy again, even having stopped crying. And they had started the training practice once again, with Politoed leading them. Unfortunately, even though the Pokemon were happy again, they managed to fall and fail their cheerleading routine again, but this time, instead of being yelled at by Tammy, they were comforted by Misty, who told them that she knew they could do it. When Tammy saw Misty encouraging her Pokemon, she began to cry as she got a flashback of her younger self also caring for her Pokemon, remembering that she once cared for her Pokemon as much as Misty would when she was focused on her dream of entertaining the crowds instead of being consumed by wanting to win, which she was now. Misty's Politoed saw Tammy crying and began to try and clap to cheer her up. But this just made Tammy cry even more, as she explained to Politoed and her grass Pokemon that she didn't feel like she deserved the clapping, explaining that she had gotten so laser-focused on winning that she had become apathetic to her Pokemon's feelings, only viewing them as cheerleading tools, adding that she had been trying to make people happy with cheerleading, but had unknowingly upset all of the Pokemon closest to her. So, essentially, she was ashamed of herself for making Pokemon sad as opposed to happy, when her goal was to do the opposite initially. She begins to cover her face in shame and state how her Pokemon were too good for her, but just then, Politoed encourages all of the grass Pokemon to cheer for Tammy, and they do, showing that they forgave Tammy and had the same desire to win as she did. So, with that, Tammy gives all her grass Pokemon and Politoed one big hug, and they decide to try practicing once more, as Politoed begins clapping, and the grass Pokemon all dance in a pyramid absolutely perfectly, with Misty remarking that the grass Pokemon and Tammy and Politoed were sure to win the competition, and allowed Politoed to help Tammy. Brock and Misty go up to Tammy and the grass Pokemon and Politoed to congratulate them on their good work, when suddenly a giant Politoed mech belonging to Team Rocket smashes through the back of the cheerleading building as Team Rocket does their motto, declaring that they were here to steal all of the Pokemon. Getting out of the Politoed mech to do some dance moves while they said this, Tammy instantly orders Team Rocket to go the fuck away, but Team Rocket do not oblige, as they instead get back into their Politoed mech and extend a huge tongue from it to capture Brock, Misty, Tammy, Togepi, Politoed, and all of the grass Pokemon, and capture them inside the mech's stomach. As Team Rocket begins to trudge away in their mech with everyone inside, they taunt that they were gonna take all of the grass Pokemon and Politoed to Giovanni and start up their own Team Rocket cheering squad to cheer him on. As for Ash and Pikachu, they had since returned to the cheerleading building after unsuccessfully getting Bean to join them, and when they came back, they instantly heard Team Rocket shouting and spotted the Politoed mech. So Ash and Pikachu began chasing after the mech, while unbeknownst to them, Bean was following them. As Ash and Pikachu approached the Politoed mech, they noticed how everyone was captured inside and demanded Team Rocket to release them. This yelling caused Team Rocket to notice Ash and Pikachu, as Jessie taunted him for being late. And suddenly, the mech stops moving and faces Ash and Pikachu. Brock warns Ash, knowing that Team Rocket was likely about to do something, but it was too late, as Team Rocket extended a huge tongue from the Politoed mech once again, and had the tongue create a huge hole in the ground, which Ash and Pikachu fell into. The tongue then deployed some sort of glue disguised as saliva, which stuck Ash and Pikachu to the tongue so that they couldn't move. Team Rocket then deploy a metal head antenna from their Politoed mech and use it to break Pikachu free from the hole and capture it inside of the antenna, leaving Ash stuck in the hole, as Jessie, while inside the Politoed mech, was fantasizing about the fact that after their dozens of attempts at digging pitfall traps to capture Ash and the gang, it was finally working. James and Meowth don't deny this, but they clarify that Jessie wasn't the one to dig any of the pitfalls. It was always James and Meowth doing the work. With Team Rocket momentarily distracted by their conversation, Ash tells Pikachu to use Thunderbolt to try and escape, but Team Rocket just laugh as they explain that the antenna was electric-proof. Team Rocket laugh even more at the fact that they had actually done what they set out to do, capturing all of the Pokemon, and begin to walk away in their mech, leaving Ash in the hole, as Meowth taunts Ash, saying that since he had been a good sport about them stealing Pikachu, they will come back with Misty, Brock, and Tammy later, although that would be in a very, very, very long time, indicating that they weren't actually going to come back with Misty, Tammy, and Brock, and they were going to capture them as well. Damn, Team Rocket took human captives then? Holy fuck. I wonder what Giovanni did with them. However, it seems Team Rocket had forgotten about capturing Bean, who, as I said earlier, had been following Ash and Pikachu, and now it was right in front of the mech, ready to stop it, blocking Team Rocket's path. Jessie and James just laugh, not intimidated at all, as they simply tell it to move out of the way, but Politoed refuses and stands its ground. This leads Meowth to suggest that they capture Bean as well, like they were initially planning, and with that, they release the tongue of the mech to try and capture it, but Bean counters the tongue by releasing a water gun. This pushes back the tongue a little bit, allowing Bean to dodge it, and then Bean uses a second water gun on the mecha's glass hold that was holding everyone captive, and this breaks the glass, freeing everyone. Tammy notices that Bean was the one who saved them, and she tries to apologize to it for earlier today, and tried to explain that she knew why Bean had ran away. But before she could get this out to Bean, Team Rocket got angry at Bean freeing all the captives, and tried to punish him by lifting up the mech's foot and going to stomp Bean. Thankfully, right before Bean was killed, Tammy, who was about to be killed as well, jumped onto Bean and managed to send them both flying out of harm's way as she leaped. Bean was impressed by Tammy for saving it and went to go check on her to make sure she was okay from the fall, but Tammy just assured Bean that she was completely fine and took the opportunity to finally thank it for saving her and Brock and Misty and all the Pokemon earlier, and explain that she knew why Bean was mad. and also why Bean may have run away in the first place, coming to the conclusion that she must have yelled at Bean a little too hard one time, and so he just needed a break to get away. But then, when he was replaced afterwards, that just made him even more angry and sad, to the point where he left. So, Tammy apologized and admitted that she wanted to work to rekindle her and Bean's friendship, and she wanted Bean to come back to her cheerleading squad. And Bean, believing that Tammy's apology was in fact sincere, accepted Tammy's request. So now they were friends again. Yay! Tammy then directed Bean's attention to the mech and stated that their primary goal right now, even though she did want to win the cheerleading competition with Bean by her side, was to make sure that Team Rocket couldn't capture any of the Pokemon again. So Bean decided to rush toward the mech to try and actually stop it this time. As for Misty and her Politoed, they wanted to help out Bean, but first, Misty saw that all the grass Pokemon were immensely frightened, even though they were free. So Misty had Politoed clap for them to cheer them up, and then she sent Politoed to help Bean. Jessie saw the Politoed cheering up the grass Pokemon from inside the mech, and she couldn't stand seeing the grass Pokemon happy, so she decided to send out her Arbok and have it attack Misty's Politoed as punishment with a headbutt, but Misty's Politoed was able to counter Arbok's headbutt with a headbutt of its own. Arbok then goes in for a Poison Sting, but both Politoads were able to dodge the Poison Sting by using their cheerleading moves. Both Politoads then teamed up, with Bean using Double Slap and Misty's Politoed using Water Gun, and these attacks were enough to knock out Arbok, forcing Jessie to recall it from inside the Politoed mech. Misty's Politoed claps with joy over defeating the Arbok, and the clapping causes all of the grass Pokemon to walk over to both Politoads, wanting to help. So, they use their cheerleading techniques that they had learned to both dodge the mech, which tried to stomp on them, and also use their techniques to propel both Politoads up to the mech, and both Politoads then used Water Gun, high-fiving each other in the process, as both of their trainers congratulated them on the good Water Gun, which not only made the mech wet, but also hit Pikachu, breaking the antenna that held him captive, allowing Pikachu to fall to the ground and Ash to catch him, since Brock had since freed Ash from the hole. Then Ash, seeing that Pikachu was wet, ordered it to use Thunderbolt, knowing that Pikachu's Thunderbolt would be made even stronger since Pikachu was wet. Team Rocket laughed, though, as they reminded Ash that the mech was electric-proof, but Ash, Brock, Misty, and Tammy all reminded Team Rocket that now that the mech was soaked with a water gun, it would be more vulnerable to electricity. So Pikachu used Thunderbolt, and it was able to send Team Rocket blasting off, also short-circuiting and exploding their mech in the process. As Pikachu jumps back into Ash's arms, both Politoads clap with joy that Team Rocket was gone, as both Politoed were now friends. Tammy wasn't shocked by this, but was shocked when it appeared that Bean's clapping was able to influence the grass Pokemon to dance all on their own, even when it had previously been unable to. Because of this, Tammy realized that since her Politoed had trained, it was just as capable as Misty's Politoed. So she informed Misty that she didn't need her Politoed anymore, and congratulated her own Politoed on doing such a good job, remarking that she was so impressed with it that she definitely wanted it to lead all the grass Pokemon in the competition, not just join by her side. Because, even though her and Bean had made up, she was still planning to have Misty's Politoed be the leader, but not anymore. Bean was very happy about this, and agreed. Tammy then realized that the competition was about to start, so she said goodbye to Ash and the gang, with Ash and the gang wishing her luck for the contest, and Tammy wishing Ash luck in the Johto League, telling him to try his best, and also pleading with Misty to make sure that she took care of her Politoed, and Misty, of course, promised that she would. With that, Ash and the gang set off, continuing their journey to Blackthorn City. The episode then ends with Bean doing his absolute best to lead the grass Pokemon, and as a result, Tammy, Bean, and the grass Pokemon end up winning the competition. Probably.